Oh, thanks very much. And I thought it was time for a little relief from COVID. So talk about something that is fun and also interesting scientifically. So let's get going. When you see 007, what does it remind you of? I mean, obviously, immediately the mind jumps to James Bond and the classic British secret agent. The creation of Ian Fleming. Now, Ian Fleming, of course, was a famed author, writing a number of James Bond novels and short stories as well. But he himself has a very interesting history because during the Second World War, Fleming worked for British naval intelligence. And he met a lot of secret agents in that role. He was involved in planning a number of spy operations. And indeed, he based many of the characters in the James Bond stories, as well as the plots, on his real life experiences. Now, this is not to say that there is great specificity here, because most of the plots were sort of conglomerations of stories that he had heard, and the characters, of course, also are conglomerates. But there's always, a kernel of fact behind whatever Ian Fleming wrote about. He was asked many times how he came to select the name James Bond, and said that he wanted something that was very simple, but that would be relatively easily remembered. And a book on his shelves, Birds of the West Indies, was written by a James Bond. And when he was looking for names, he came across this book, and he thought that James Bond would be a great name. James Bond was a real person, as you can see here, but he was no secret agent. He was an ornithologist. And in a number of the James Bond movies, ornithology does play a role, because Fleming was so taken with the science of birdwatching. And as you can see here, he said, I wanted the simplest, dullest, plainest sounding name I could find. And James Bond was much better than something more interesting like Peregrine Carruthers. Well, Peregrine Carruthers 007 doesn't really roll off the tongue. So I think he made a pretty good selection. And, he wanted his character to be a simple person who was, as you can see, just an instrument wielded by a government department. And he didn't want too much personality in there. He also talked about the way that he envisioned the look of James Bond. And an artist recreated Fleming's vision. And there he is, sort of a debonair gentleman, again, based on some of the naval officers and real secret agents that Fleming met while he was serving in the intelligence department of the Navy. So the 007, where does this number come from? Well, as you can see in this little snippet here, Fleming did a lot of research when he was writing his books. He wanted to be as as factual as possible. And when he was doing his research, he came across the story of British code breakers deciphering diplomatic messages that went between Germany and Mexico, especially German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann, who was corresponding with the Mexican government about unrestricted submarine warfare. And the Germans, of course, were bent on trying to impede the US Navy with their newfangled submarines. But anyway, this particular type of correspondence between Germany and Mexico was given the diplomatic code name 0070. And perhaps it was this that appealed to Fleming, and he just left off the 0 and retained the 007. He himself never explained where the number came from. So these are views offered by other people. But There's another one that I think is even more interesting, more intriguing about the origin of 007. And this takes us back to Elizabethan England and a very interesting, enigmatic character by the name of John Dee. John Dee was an astronomer, a mathematician, a philosopher, a cartographer, indeed, someone that we would call a scientist if indeed the description stopped at that point. But Dee was also into fortune telling. He was into speaking with the spirits. He was into sorcery. So this is why I say that he was a very, very enigmatic character. But he first came to the attention of young Princess Elizabeth, who was the sister of Queen Mary, who was queen at the time. We know her as Bloody Mary because that's exactly what she was. She was not very kind to her enemies. So in any case, Princess Elizabeth came across John Dee, who made a prediction for her. And he said, do not despair, because apparently Elizabeth was in a state of depression. And Dee told her that she would become queen in 4 months because Queen Mary would die. And indeed, this came to be true. And as you can imagine, once Elizabeth became queen, she was willing to reward John Dee for having predicted this scenario. So he became advisor and astrologer to Queen Mary, and apparently did a very, very good job. He was keen at advising her about science, and he would also sign his reports to her with this rather interesting logo. Now, she had been very, very impressed by his talents and had given him the task of finding intelligence about her adversaries, other kings and queens in other countries. And when John Dee submitted his reports to her, instead of signing his name, it would be signed with this symbol, where the 2 circles apparently represented eyes, meaning that these reports were the queen's eyes only, and the 2 lines above and to the side, which looked like the number 7 and could well have been because 7 was the lucky number of the alchemists. And John Dee certainly was into alchemy as well. We know this. He carried out all sorts of experiments that he even demonstrated to the queen. And there is this very, very famous painting painted in the 1800s. So it's a historical work of Queen Elizabeth being shown some sort of a chemical demonstration by John Dee. And if we focus in on the demonstration here, you can see that he is certainly pouring a vial of some substance into this flaming brazier at his feet, and something is happening. We're not exactly sure what, but it kind of reminds me of an experiment that we normally do in chemistry lectures, where we sprinkle a little bit of maybe lycopodium powder or gunpowder into a flame, and we see a flash as the powder catches fire. So this may have been what he was demonstrating, but from his writings, we certainly know that he was into carrying out alchemical experiments. He, for example, made silver chloride, although he's not exactly clear on how he did it, but in those days, the way silver chloride would have been made was by taking metallic silver, dissolving it in nitric acid to make silver nitrate, which when reacted with salt, sodium chloride, would form silver chloride. So he was certainly a very, very adept man. And as you can see, because of these kind of demonstrations, he had a reputation of being a conjurer. Obviously, when people saw these sort of magical demonstrations, they didn't really understand it, and they would very often ascribe paranormal explanations to this. There's something very interesting about the painting that I just showed you, because recently researchers have taken X-rays of this painting, and something is revealed that is absolutely fascinating. When you look at the X-ray, well, of course, you see the wooden scaffolding on which the canvas is stretched. But if you look around John Dee, you see a circle of skulls. Here's a close-up. That was present in the original painting, because I think the painter wanted to show that John Dee was kind of a meld of legitimate science and also necromancy, or belief in paranormal phenomena, as represented here by the skulls. But it seems that whoever commissioned the painting in the 1800s did not like that particular interpretation and asked the artist to paint over it. Now, something else to notice here, when you look at the X-ray and you look at the top right-hand corner, you can see a globe there. When the work was redone by the artist to take out the skulls, there was another change that was made. The gentleman you see sitting in the black robe to the right has now been inserted. And that was Edward Kelley, a man with whom John Dee came to partner because he was a believer in contact with the spirit world. Now, Kelley was also an enigmatic person, very much like John Dee. And you can see the hat that he wears covers his ears, or I should say, where his ears had been, because Kelley had been convicted as a forger, and the punishment for forgery in those days was to have your ears cropped, which is the reason that he is wearing that hat. Anyway, John Dee and Edward Kelley struck up a partnership. Dee believed that Kelley was able to communicate with spirits, particularly with angels, and also that he had the secret of the philosopher's stone. He was able to turn base metals into gold. And here is John Dee depicted with the younger Kelley. And together with this seal that you see in front, that was called the seal of God, which Kelley used in order to communicate with angels. And you can see the angel depicted there in the globe, which the globe, of course, also represents the crystal ball, because they believed that there were ways of seeing into the future. Well, this was a very interesting pair, and Dee came to believe that Kelley had supernatural powers and that he could actually communicate with the angels. And the angels gave him advice, which he then translated from angelic language to common language for John Dee. And books have been written, as you can see, on John Dee's conversations with angels. In any case, Dee and Kelley toured Europe, carrying out seances, trying to communicate with spirits, and they became quite famous. And Kelley, of course, would also make the claim that he could turn metals into gold. He was never able to do that, obviously, and at one point in Bohemia, he was even jailed for not being able to meet the promise that he had told a nobleman at that time, that he would be able to supply him with gold. So there is John Dee, a very interesting character, and recently an operetta has been written about him in England and has been performed to great acclaim. And here in a scene from this operetta, you can see John Dee performing some magic, where you see flames coming out of a book. Well, this is a book that I very commonly use as well. It is, of course, gimmicked. It's available from magic dealers, and flames indeed do come out of this book. Also in the operetta, John Dee is seen looking into a mirror in order to foretell the future. that has historic relevance. And the mirror that John Dee used way back in the 1500s in an attempt to foresee the future is now in the British Museum. And here you see the mirror to the right, and to the left is the wooden casing in which it is kept. Now that mirror was made of a volcanic rock called obsidian. And here's that volcanic rock. Now it turns out when you take this volcanic rock and you polish it, it develops a fascinating shine. In fact, a mirror-like finish. How do you polish it? In a most interesting fashion. The traditional way to convert obsidian rock, this volcanic rock, into a mirror, that is to have a shiny surface, is to polish it with the fecal matter of a bat. It turns out that bats eat insects, of course, but they don't digest them completely. So some of the skeleton of the insects comes out in the poop of the bat. And that is a hard abrasive, calcium carbonate. And this is the abrasive that can be used to polish that mirror. And so that is the mirror that we see in the British Museum. And it is displayed along with the crystal ball that John Dee used, small crystal ball, you see it in the forefront. And you also see the seal that was used to communicate with the angels to the right. The obsidian mirror in its picture shows its property because, as you can see, the photographer is reflected in the black surface. So this is an absolutely fascinating historical item, as are these wax tablets, which were used to communicate with the angels. John Dee was also a collector of books. He had over 3,000 books, which of course in those days was a huge collection because books were not so easy to come by. They were, of course, mostly handwritten. And he added his own annotations to these books. So he had just a spectacular library. For example, this book here by Konrad Gessner, a Swiss writer, also a philosopher, alchemist, and the book is called De Remediis Secretis, which means secret remedies. So he had a vast collection of these books. Konrad Gessner is also interesting in another respect. He was the first person to make a pencil, and there it is with a slab of lead in between two pieces of wood. And this was the original pencil. Today, of course, we no longer use lead, although we still call it lead, but what we actually use is graphite. So here we have the question. Was John Dee the original 007? Maybe so. There's an interesting, historical evidence here. But of course, Ian Fleming is no longer with us, so it's impossible to confirm whether or not he had John Dee in mind. But let's get down to the more modern versions of 007, and the very first movie, starring, of course, Sean Connery, was Dr. No. It was not the first book that Ian Fleming wrote. The first book was Casino Royale, but the first movie was Dr. No. And of course, there was that classic scene in Dr. No when Ursula Andress emerges from the ocean in that classic white bikini and meets up James Bond for the first time. And that, of course, was Sean Connery. And I think for devotees of the James Bond films, Sean Connery was James Bond. The others were pretty good actors playing the role of James Bond. And this iconic bikini went on sale at an auction, and it brought in a huge amount of money. I don't know exactly who bought it and where it is now. But here is the promo scene for Dr. No with Sean Connery and Ursula Andress. In Dr. No, we were also introduced to the first villain that we encountered, or at least that James Bond encountered in movies, and that was Dr. No, who had an artificial hand because his real hand had been contaminated by radiation due to his work. And what was his work? He was trying to interfere with American space launches. Now, this was in the early 1960s, when there was a lot of attention focused on Cape Canaveral and the early space program. And the plot in this movie revolves around that, where Dr. No, who was the leader of a nefarious organization called Spectre, wanted to have power in the world and wanted to disrupt American space launches. And he did this with a radio beam that he had developed, which was energized by radioactivity. Now, it did not make any scientific sense at all, but there was this giant facility where radioactive water was somehow involved in creating this radio beam that was supposed to disrupt American rocket launches, but obviously James Bond foiled this whole business. There was some chemistry involved in Dr. No as well. When one of James Bond's predators, working for Spectre, was basically caught by Bond, and before giving Bond any kind of information that Bond was asking for, he took out a cigarette and basically bit into it, and the cigarette contained a capsule of cyanide. And this, at that time, of course, was very much a topical kind of discussion, because there were stories about, that had come out of Nazi Germany about some of the higher ups committing suicide by chomping down on cyanide-laced capsules. Well, this certainly could be done. Ian Fleming knew about the hazards of cyanide. And of course, it is true that during the Second World War, cyanide capsules were in fact given to people who were in very dangerous situations where they might have to kill themselves instead of giving up any information. Both the Germans and the Americans and the British furnished people with cyanide capsules. Although contrary to the information that you may have heard, there were no teeth that had cyanide embedded in them so that you could bite on it in case this was necessary. That never existed. Anyway, the cyanide story emerged again in the movie Skyfall. And here, of course, it was Daniel Craig, who is the most recent of all the James Bonds. And this is a very interesting story because it's all about another villain. In this case, it is Raoul Silva, who was a former OO himself, but he felt that he had been abandoned and turned over to the Chinese by the British government, and he became very, very vindictive about this. And when he tried to commit suicide after having been captured, he bit into the tooth that supposedly contained the cyanide, which of course doesn't make any sense. But in any case, as described in the film, as you can see here, the capsule didn't kill him, but even worse, it burned his insides and damaged his face and his gums, basically burning away his cheekbone. And there is a scene in the film where he takes out his fake teeth and his face collapses, and kind of frightening. And the suggestion is that this is because of the cyanide. Now, cyanide would not do this. Cyanide can kill you, but it would certainly not have this kind of an effect. But anyway, as I said, there were no such things as teeth to bite into to release cyanide. But there were cyanide capsules during the Second World War. And interestingly enough, even glasses that had a capsule of cyanide in the built into them, so that could be chewed if it was necessary. So that indeed was a real item. In Skyfall, M, who is the leader of the British secret agency, MI5 as we know it, was a lady, played of course by Judi Dench. In the earlier films, M was a gentleman. And in this scene from the film, you see in front of Judi Dench, the British Bulldog. And that British Bulldog is wrapped in the British flag. This is a symbol of Britain. And it very likely that something like that would have been on the desk of someone in charge of British intelligence. And in the film, unfortunately, there's a bomb, and M's office gets blown up together with the Bulldog. In the end of this movie, unfortunately, M dies in the arms of James Bond. But Bond is given a memory of M, and it is the restored Bulldog, which actually exists. It is a ceramic, and I just happen to have one of those in real life, as you can see. And if you turn it upside down, you can see that it is a Royal Dalton figurine. And it is very interesting because you can see the crack in it. Now that crack is put there on purpose because the piece had to be put together after the supposed explosion in the movie. So Royal Dalton created this, and it is going to make another appearance in the next James Bond movie, which is No Time to Die. Originally, this was to have come out a year ago, but because of COVID, it has been pushed back, and apparently it is going to release in October because they want a real movie audience. They don't want to release this on Netflix or on Crave. And this is going to star Daniel Craig again, but he says that this is his last effort at portraying James Bond because he was hurt so many times in the filming of his various movies that he doesn't want to do this anymore. All right, but getting back to the classic James Bond movies, Dr. No was followed by From Russia with Love. Again, it was starring Sean Connery. And this time there were two agencies that he was fighting. There was the Soviet Secret Service, and again, there was Spectre. And there's a number of interesting scenes in these movies, but I think the iconic scene is his battle with a Soviet intelligence officer. And she is wearing these very special shoes. And when triggered, a little knife comes out of the toe of the shoe, and there it is, the shoe that was used in the movie. And supposedly it was covered with a terrible toxin called tetrodotoxin. And this was supposed to do away with any victim who was kicked. Dr. No originally, of course, was a book before it was made into a movie, and so was From Russia with Love. And although in the movie versions, From Russia with Love followed Dr. No, the books actually came out in reverse order. And in From Russia with Love, the book ends with the fight that I just described, and you don't know whether or not James Bond survives. And in the subsequent book, which was Dr. No, we found out that he did survive, even though he was kicked with the poison. But that's not exactly the way it was portrayed in the movie. In the movie, there is the fight, but he never gets kicked with the tainted knife. So what is the taint? It is a poison that is produced by the pufferfish called tetrodotoxin. Now, the pufferfish is a very, very interesting fish. It doesn't look puffed up here, but whenever it is threatened, it has the ability of blowing itself up like this. so that these spikes are exposed, and any predator that dares to approach this fish can get impaled on these spikes and be injected with tetrodotoxin. This is a terrible poison because trace amounts of it are enough to kill. This is not fictional, this is real. It is also real that the pufferfish apparently is delicious, but it does have this toxin. In Japan, there are special restaurants that serve the pufferfish, and they usually have some kind of a symbol or a logo to indicate what it is that they serve. In this particular case, as you see, it happens to be a giant pufferfish. The chefs in these restaurants are trained for 2 years to make sure that they can eviscerate this fish properly and take out the organs that harbor the tetrodotoxin so as not to poison any diner. And the chefs are very successfully trained, because these days it's very rare in Japan that someone succumbs to eating fugu, as the dish is called. Although it still happens, but not in restaurants. It happens when people try to prepare the fish at home. And of course, they're not able to do so. Well, we here in North America, I think first heard about this rather strange story of the pufferfish from Homer Simpson. The Simpsons once go out to dine and they want to have an esoteric experience. So they go to a Japanese restaurant where fugu is served. Well, it turns out that the chef, who is an expert at preparing the dish, is having a little fling behind the restaurant with one of the waitresses, leaving the sous chef to prepare the fish, who is not very adept and does not properly eviscerate the fish, and Homer ends up eating some of the fish with intact poison. The manager realizes this and informs Homer that he has only 24 hours to live. And Homer, of course, starts going over his life and panics, as one would do. But it turns out that he survives, as some people do, because it depends on just how much of the poison is ingested. And he says that he's going to have a changed life, and he's going to do everything right from then on. So an interesting story of poison in that particular movie. There are other James Bond movies in which poisons appear. For example, in Casino Royale. Now, in the book version, this was the first writing about James Bond that Ian Fleming did. This was the first novel, but it was, I think something like the 8th or the 9th James Bond, no, even more than that. It was probably in the 20s. I think now there have been 27 James Bond movies. So this Casino Royale movie was made much, much later, as we can tell, because it starred Daniel Craig. Anyway, he is playing in a casino where he is poisoned, or at least attempt at poisoning him is made by an arch villain. And here's the scene where this toxic liquid, which we find out is extracted from the foxglove plant and therefore contains digitalis, is put into his martini. And this is supposed to kill him, because this is a cardiac toxin, meaning that it affects the heart. It causes very, very rapid heartbeat. And indeed, an extract of the foxglove plant is used in medicine. Digitalis is the extract. And it goes back to the 1700s, and it comes out of an old wives' tale about the use of extract of these flowers to treat congestive heart failure, or dropsy, as it was called in those days. So certainly this is a real substance. And he starts to feel faint, James Bond does, after ingesting this martini that had been laced with the extract of the foxglove. And he rushes back to his car, where he does have some emergency supplies. And he, on the phone that he has in the car, he contacts head office in London, and he's told to go into a compartment in the car where there are all kinds of emergency substances, and to take out a syringe that has lidocaine in it and to immediately inject himself with it. And he does. And lidocaine is a substance that is actually used to control cardiac arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats. In this case, he's told to follow that with using a defibrillator. And again, there's a defibrillator in the car, in the emergency kit, and he's told to put it on and to defibrillate himself. And eventually, of course, it ends up working, and he walks away as if nothing had happened. Can this be? Well, digitalis is a real substance, although obviously these days, if someone has congestive heart failure, they're not told to drink digitalis tea or to eat the flowers. They are given a specified extract, purified, single compound called digoxin. But it certainly is true that in a higher than therapeutic dose, digoxin is a very dangerous material, and it can trigger irregular heartbeat. It can kill. There are antidotes that are available for this, but the way that James Bond handled it, that is with the injection of the lidocaine and with the defibrillator, that is a lot of artistic license being taken there. But the idea of using various chemicals as toxins is pervasive in the James Bond films. For example, in Moonraker, which starred Roger Moore. Roger Moore, who already had made a name for himself playing the Saint on television, was selected to be the replacement for Sean Connery when Connery no longer wanted to be involved. Connery had made 4 James Bond movies, and then the role was taken over by Roger Moore. In the Moonraker, we meet another classic villain, and that is Hugo Drax, who, like so many of the villains in the James Bond movies, wants to control the world somehow. But he has really a nefarious plan. What he wants to do is to basically create a super race. He wants to wipe out the whole world, except animals, and he wants to repopulate it with his own selected species who have been placed in space in a spaceship, who will then repopulate the Earth after everyone has been killed off with a toxin that he has developed, which also would be launched at the Earth from space. And that toxin is a manipulation of a chemical that is extracted from orchids. Now, again, there is some real science here because obviously it certainly is part of pharmaceutical research to take substances in plants and to try to improve on them. A classic example is Taxol, which is extracted from the bark of a tree used in chemotherapy, but it can be chemically manipulated to make it even more active. But in this case, Hugo Drax uses the orchid, and from it isolates a compound that then is chemically converted to this clear liquid toxin that will essentially kill off humans. Interestingly enough, in the movie, we actually get a glimpse of the supposed molecular structure of this substance. And it doesn't really make sense the way that it is drawn, that there are some missing bonds, and it's not clear what the DS attached to the carbon there means. And this is not really a way that the molecular structure would be depicted. You would have thought that, spending so many millions on making a movie, they could have asked a chemist to at least come up with a structure that is properly written and that makes some sort of sense. So anyway, this is the substance that supposedly is going to do away with people in the world. and Drax launches his space shuttle. And again, this played well in those days because this movie was released when there was a lot of interest and a lot of publicity about the space program, especially the shuttle. And you know, it was so popular that there were even toys that were based on the Moonraker shuttle. Anyway, his idea was to launch the shuttle into space, which would carry people that would then repopulate the Earth, but would also be able to permeate the atmosphere with this poison that would kill everyone off. And needless to say, James Bond, of course, once again, is able to foil this, this plot, which really doesn't make any sense in any way. But Moonraker also introduced us to this very intriguing character, Jaws, played by Richard Keel. And there are classic scenes here where he uses his metallic mouth, which has unbelievable strength. In fact, it can even bite through steel cables. Well, obviously, this is total nonsense. There's a lot of nonsense in the James Bond movies. Now, let me talk about one other type, which takes us to what I think is my favorite James Bond movie, which is Goldfinger. Goldfinger came after Dr. No and From Russia with Love, so it was the third Bond film starring Sean Connery, and it had a much larger budget. One of the things that people really remember about Goldfinger is the car. The Aston Martin, which was just an amazing vehicle. And of course, it was given to James Bond by Q, who was the sort of the supply master working for intelligence. And this car, while it looked sort of ordinary, certainly was not. It had all kinds of gizmos built into it. The front headlights hid machine guns. There was a contraption that would release oil from the back so that any following car would skid off the road. There were rocket launchers. There was an injection seat. Of course, there was a telephone, which in those days was a novelty in the car. And there was a radar tracker. There was a sprayer that released nails. And then there were these tire slashers that came out of the wheel, very much like in Ben-Hur, where in that case it was chariots that were destroyed. Here it was other cars. Very interesting. Anyway, the Aston Martin eventually sold again for exorbitant amount of money, as one might expect. But the vehicle, of course, didn't really have all of these contraptions built into it. They were fakes, but the car itself was real. Anyway, Goldfinger himself was a very interesting character, played by the German actor Gert Fröbe. And something that I find really amazing is that he didn't speak English very well. And all of his lines were dubbed. And it's very hard to pick that up because the dubbing was so good. In the book, and indeed in the movie, Goldfinger is supposed to be English. And they never explained how come he has an accent. And it's hard to understand why, if his voice had to be dubbed, which it was, why did they dub a German accent? Why didn't they just portray him as a Brit, as he was supposed to be, both in the book and in the movie? Anyway, he was, of course, smitten with gold. Obviously, his clothing was gold. His first name was Auric, A-U-R-I-C. A-U, of course, is a chemical symbol for gold. We are also introduced in Goldfinger to Oddjob, who was his manservant, who never spoke, but he had this amazing hat, which was steel rimmed, and he could fling it around like a frisbee. And in this particular case, when ordered to do so, he flung it at a statue to impress Bond, and easily took off the statue's head. Unfortunately for Oddjob, he eventually dies in the end of the film when he tries to chop off James's head with the hat, but the hat gets embedded in a metal cage. And I'll describe exactly what is going on here in a minute. This was the attempt to rob Fort Knox. And as he tries to retrieve the hat, which missed James, Bond manages to electrify the metal here, and by attaching electric cables to it, and poor Oddjob is electrocuted. The character of Goldfinger, Fleming actually based, at least the name, was based on a real person. And this was a Hungarian architect by the name of Erno Goldfinger, who Fleming did not like. Not really because of his personality, it's not even clear that they ever met, but he did not like the way that he wanted to build large concrete blocks to replace some of the quaint British houses. And apparently Fleming really objected to this and decided to name his villain after Goldfinger. As you can imagine, Erno Goldfinger objected to his name being used like that and threatened to sue Fleming. Well, that lawsuit never came to anything because what Fleming said, if you don't like the name Goldfinger, I'm just going to change it to Goldprick. And that scared Goldfinger, Erno Goldfinger, enough that he didn't want everything to do this. So they came to some sort of settlement where Goldfinger got 6 copies, original copies of the book. And that was it. So there was no further lawsuit. Of course, the real memorable scene in Goldfinger is the gold paint that is used to do away with Jill Masterton, played by Shirley Eaton. And this was the way that Goldfinger would do away with his enemies. The idea was that if you were painted gold, your skin couldn't breathe and you would suffocate. That makes no sense because we do not breathe through our skin, we breathe through our mouth. There may be some problems with toxicity here, but you certainly would not suffocate because your skin is painted. But this scene became very, very famous. In fact, so famous that it was even used on the cover of Life magazine, and it made the actor Shirley Eaton famous. A little corollary to this story is that in Germany, a gentleman had a fight with his girlfriend, and he wanted to get back at her. How? By painting himself and committing suicide. He couldn't find any gold paint, but he found some blue paint. So he painted himself, but nothing happened because, of course, we don't breathe through our skin. He ended up in hospital, and they gave him some medication to calm him down, and they also used a solvent to get off the paint. But he was back a few weeks later, again having done the same thing. And this time he ended up in a mental hospital. But interesting that he got the idea from Goldfinger. Besides the Golden Lady scene, another memorable scene, of course, is when Goldfinger tries to basically do away with James Bond with a laser. And Bond finds himself strapped to this table, which is, of course, made of gold. And Goldfinger has invented this laser, which here threatens to basically bisect our hero. Now, this was at a time when there was no such thing as a laser, certainly not one that could melt metal. I mean, that would have been impossible at that time. So the movie makers had some vision here because, of course, eventually lasers were developed that were able to do this. Anyway, the classic scene is one where Bond says, Goldfinger, what do you expect me to do? You expect me to talk? And Goldfinger responds, "No, Mr. Bond, expect you to die." He doesn't die, of course, but the red beam is added in post-production. But what about the melting of the table? That was a very interesting scene. And it was done by a welder who was hidden under the table with an oxyacetylene torch, actually blasting through the metal. So it really looked like it was melting because it was melting. And there were beads of sweat on Sean Connery's head. And if you look at the movie, you will see the beads of sweat because he was really concerned. He was feeling the heat and it was getting close to his privates. So he was concerned about coming out of this scene intact, which of course he did. Now, as I said, at this time, there were no lasers that could have done this. Indeed, the laser had just been invented, 1960, the world's first laser by Theodore Maiman. He built this based upon the theories of Charles Hart Townes and Arthur Schawlow, both of whom received the Nobel Prize in Physics, although not the same year, for their theoretical work on lasers. But this was theoretical. And the first laser, as I said, was this one by Theodore Maiman, and he did it according to the theory of Townes and Schawlow. Now let's get back to our Goldfinger movie. What did Goldfinger really want to do? He wanted to get his hands on all of the gold that was stored in Fort Knox, which is the major US gold depository. He did not actually want to steal the gold. What he planned to do was to make the gold supply in Fort Knox radioactive, so that it would be useless, so that it could not be taken out of there, it could not be handled. And if this gold supply was made useless, it meant that his own gold supply was going to rise in value. In the movie, he planned to carry out this operation by first killing off all of the soldiers who were around Fort Knox to guard it. There are soldiers around Fort Knox to guard it, but not the way it's depicted in the movie. I mean, there are not huge armies there. Anyway, Goldfinger's idea was to knock out the guards. How? With the use of his crony, a lady pilot who had a pilot school training women pilots. Her name was Pussy Galore. Very interesting name. How they got away with it is interesting in that movie. Anyway, so Pussy Galore is supposed to equip her airplane with nerve gas that is going to be sprayed around Fort Knox to take care of all of the guards so that Goldfinger could come in with his nuclear bomb, and dirty bomb exploded inside the fort and contaminate the gold, make his own gold supply much more valuable. Now, nerve gases, of course, were certainly known by the 1960s. In fact, during the Second World War, the Germans had developed nerve gases. The first one was Taban, followed by sarin. They were never used in warfare, but they certainly were developed. And unfortunately, they have been used since. As we know, in Iraq, Saddam has used nerve gas. So in theory, nerve gas could have been used. Well, it turns out that James Bond manages to seduce Pussy Galore and convince her not to go along with the plot and to replace the nerve gas with some innocuous gas. And the soldiers just play along at first. When the spray comes, they just fall down as if they were dead. And of course, when Goldfinger approaches, they all jump up. But Goldfinger does manage to get the bomb ticking. And it obviously has to be stopped because it has to have a happy ending. And James Bond manages to do that with 7 seconds left. And of course, we see the iconic 007 on the clock as it comes to an end. So the nerve gas is never used in the film the way that Goldfinger wanted to use it, but he does actually use it before the forced Knox attempt, when he knocks off some of his cronies whom he has enlisted in order to get in on this plot. And after he has taken their money investment, he gets rid of them at his home, where all of a sudden the windows close and the doors close, so that there's no ventilation, and the nerve gas is sprayed in, and they are killed off. So there's some interesting science there. It's kind of wishy-washy, but at least there's a kernel of truth. In any case, Goldfinger was followed by Thunderball. This was the fourth movie in which James Bond was played by Sean Connery. And the movie begins with a really interesting scene where James takes off with a rocket belt. And the rocket belt is a real thing. It actually was developed by the Bell Company in the US, and it was a fascinating contraption. The idea was just like any other rocket. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So what you need is some sort of gas coming out in one direction that will propel the wearer of this in the opposite direction. And schematically, this is what we have. The liquid inside is hydrogen peroxide. And when hydrogen peroxide breaks down, it breaks down into oxygen and water. But because that chemical reaction occurs at a very high temperature, these come out in the form of steam and oxygen gas. So here's the schematic, where the hydrogen peroxide, as you can see, is stored in two chambers. And there's nitrogen gas under pressure, which then pushes the hydrogen peroxide into the gas generating chamber, where there's a catalyst that breaks the hydrogen peroxide down into water and oxygen. It's a very exothermic reaction. So the water turns into steam. The steam and the oxygen come out at a very high pressure, and that propels the wearer in the opposite direction. This is not science fiction. It actually does work. And in the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, a pilot, I guess that's what we would call him, wearing the rocket pack, flew across the stadium. It was very, very impressive. Now, this really doesn't have much of a practical application because the flying time is very short. It can only hold about 30 or 40 seconds of fuel. So you have to make sure that when that fuel runs out, you're close to the ground. So there we have some interesting, I hope, insight into the science of James Bond. Much of it is not portrayed in an accurate fashion, but there is always some smidgen of scientific fact behind it. And it seems that the James Bond franchise will keep going, and I'm sure that we will have more gizmos and indeed more science. But the biggest question that is being asked now is, who is going to be the next James Bond? We have already had Daniel Craig, of course, we have had Pierce Brosnan, we've had Roger Moore, we had Sean Connery, we had George Lazenby, we had Timothy Dalton. What they all had in common was they all liked their martinis. And as we know, shaken, not stirred. And believe it or not, that has been scientifically investigated as well. University of Western Ontario actually researchers looked at it and found that martinis have more antioxidants when they are shaken and not stirred. And to push this along, there was another study published in the British Medical Journal about James Bond's drinking habits. And they calculated that Bond drank way, way too much, and he could never have functioned with all the drinking that he did. And they had also their own view on the shaken and not stirred. They thought that because of all his drinking, James Bond suffered from a tremor. and therefore he could not have properly stirred his martini, but he could have shaken it. So that's it. Interesting stuff. Next question is, who will portray James Bond in the future? A number of candidates have been put forward. The suggestion has even been made that the next James Bond may actually be a Janine, Jane, or a Jeanette Bond. So we're waiting to see who will succeed Daniel Craig and what new scientific smidgen of truth will be blasted into orbit in the next James Bond movie. Remember that you can always check with our website for our weekly newsletter. You can sign up there. And we have thousands of other articles that are of interest